Good to be with you here today. I'm talking to you from north central Mexico at our organic research farm here. So if the internet goes out, I'll have to go to my phone and call in, but so far so good today. I'm happy to speak here today about regenerative food and farming and land use in the context of our current catastrophic situation. I want to point out that even though things are very difficult, obviously, not only in the US, but all over the world, that it's very important that we try to get a grip on the big picture. And as I point out in my new book, Grassroots Rising, it's very important that we try to move beyond gloom and doom and talk about the positive solutions. And the reason for this, of course, is that people who are dwelling on doom and gloom are not often empowered in the way they are if they can actually hear about a solution to the problem. And even better, if they can go see that solution with their very own eyes. So we're very fortunate at this point in history to have a solution to the looming problem of climate catastrophe and all the issues that relate to that, like deteriorating public health and damage to the environment and biodiversity and the extreme poverty that affects half of the world's population, 3.5 billion people who live in rural villages and communities, and the widespread chronic disease and mental anguish that people are going through. Thank goodness we have a solution. The solution is visible right now in all the 195 countries of the world and all the million communities that we each live in, either urban or rural communities. These regenerative practices that can save us are not new in many cases. They're the product of looking at indigenous and traditional practices that have been going on in some cases for thousands of years. The problem is that these best practices, regenerative practices in our areas, in our regions, in our countries are often not well known at all. And they're often not funded properly. And the practitioners of these regenerative farms and ranches and ecosystem restoration projects are so busy just trying to get through day to day that they have difficulty projecting the positive message of what they're doing, connecting with others who are doing it, gathering political support in their regions or countries to enable policy change to drive regeneration instead of degeneration. They're typically not in a position to talk to investors, both public and private, who are putting their money into degenerative practices for the most part, i.e. the stock market, instead of regenerative. So, but the good news is that we are not marginal on the earth. According to the estimates of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, they say in an article where they're quoted in the New York Times that they believe that approximately 5 to 10% of all the farmers on the earth, the 570 million farms and ranches, are actually practicing a form of agriculture that can be described as regenerative or partly regenerative. And that if this 5 to 10% of the world's farmers and herdspeople and ranchers can get a little support from consumers buying their products, from governments helping them, from investors helping them, they can become fully regenerative and set an example for the best practices all over. One of the things that I learned in writing my book, Grassroots Rising, the call to action on climate, farming, food, and a Green New Deal, is that we are underestimating the power of these best practices around the world. And I want to underline around the world. Because if we're just looking at slightly improving, say, farming practices or ranching practices, you're right, we should be pessimistic. That's not enough. It's too little too late to save us. But if you're looking at what are the examples of the very best practices that exist in the different ecosystems of the planet, oh, you see there's an enormous amount of carbon that is being sequestered. There's an enormous amount of fertility that's returning to the soil. There's an enormous amount of increased rainfall that are infiltrating into the topsoil. There's an enormous leap in the nutritional density of the foods and the health of the animals and the economic system or revitalization in these communities. So what I argue in my book, Grassroots Rising, which is essentially, I'm trying to come up with a roadmap for how we get from where we are today in 2020, a thoroughly degenerated society in all aspects, heading for climate catastrophe and the related collapse of our life support systems on the planet. How do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? And how do we do this really quickly in 10 years? We use as a signpost of progress this idea of net zero emissions by 2030. This is what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Sunrise Movement and the Green New Deal in the US Congress, which has about 105 Democratic supporters in the Senate and the House, are calling for. They're not calling for zero emissions by 2030 because that's impossible, you know. We are not going to all be driving electric cars or riding on electric mass transportation. We're not going to get rid of all fossil fuel emissions in the United States by 2030. That is just not going to happen. What can happen, and is happening really, if you look at the trends, is that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next 10 years. Now, Germany is going to reduce their emissions by 60%, and a lot of other countries are going to go even further. We're going to see places like Norway. We're already seeing Bhutan is already carbon neutral. But you can make a plausible case that we can convert at a faster rate away from fossil fuels into alternative energy and radical energy conservation. And we can retool our transportation, our manufacturing, our food processing and systems enough to where instead of 6 billion tons of CO2 coming up from the US every year, we can get that down in half. I really believe we can. We'll still be heading for catastrophe, unfortunately. However, what the regeneration movement has been able to put on the table for discussion over the last 10 years, and especially the last few years in the United States, is, you know, there's two sides to starting to solve the climate crisis. One of them is reduction of fossil fuel emissions. I think most people understand that. What they don't understand is the other part, the drawdown part. The fact that you know, photosynthesis can draw down very large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and put it back where it used to be in our trees, in our plants, in our grasses, in our soil. Scientists point out that before humans embarked on a disastrous, destructive path in terms of our land use and burning fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow, we used to have 3 to 8% average was the average of carbon in our soils and in our biota, our living plants. It used to be 3 to 8%. Well, what is it now? Now, this is the global average. Right now, it's around 1%. Okay? So where did all this carbon go? And there's other things up there too, the nitrous oxide, the methane, and so on. Where did it go? Well, it went up in the atmosphere, and it went up and went into the oceans. It is wreaking havoc at this point, this misplaced carbon. So the bottom line is that if we can draw down a significant amount in the United States, this would be about 3 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere in 10 years. This, along with the reductions we could achieve from as rapid a move as we can away from fossil fuels, leaving the remaining, quote, reserves in the ground, we could reach zero net emissions by 2030. And of course, as Adam and as all of us know who have looked into this more deeply, it's not enough to get in the United States to net zero emissions. This has to be a global march toward regeneration and toward alternative energy. But even beyond that, say we stabilize emissions in 2030 to where we're not putting up more emissions than we are now. We're still headed for disaster because of the feedback that's already built into the system. So beyond 2030, we have to go into not just zero net emissions in the United States and the other 194 countries of the world. We got to go into net negative drawdown. In other words, we're going to have to draw down about 300 billion tons of carbon or a trillion tons of CO2 that are lodged up in the atmosphere right now. If we really want to not only stop abrupt runaway global warming, but actually start moving back to climate stability. Okay, so all this, which you probably already know, something that you may not know is that in order to draw down 50% of our emissions in the United States in 10 years, and other countries, like in Mexico, we've got a plan down here as well for reaching zero net emissions by 2030. We've got to look not just at practitioners who are doing a better job of farming and ranching and managing landscapes. We got to look at the best of the best, because if we don't scale up the best of the best in every ecosystem, we don't have time left. And so what I point out in chapter 8 in my book is that if we look at the best practices in the United States right now of our embryonic regeneration movement, what we found is that there's enormous amounts of carbon being sequestered and other ecosystem restoration practices. So if you look at, let's say, the best holistic management of livestock, say someone like Gabe Brown in North Dakota or Will Harris in Georgia. These are two examples of farms that people have read a lot about. These farms are sequestering enormous amounts of carbon. They're sequestering 5, 6, 10 times as much carbon as the peer-reviewed journals indicate that are out there. And if you look at the best practices, if you're looking at it for a small farm, like Singing Frogs Farm just north of San Francisco, they have sequestered enormous amounts of carbon in a biointensive organic situation. You look at the best practitioners of grazing, enormous amounts. And am I still with you here? I hope so.
You're with us, Ronnie.
Okay, good. My screen went kind of crazy here for a minute.
Technology always comes to our rescue at every conference.
Okay, so, you know, we need to look at these best practices in the United States and around the world, and it's very, very exciting. You know, when you look at what's called adaptive multi-paddock grazing, all right, that's a mouthful, but what it means is if you put your livestock together, your herbivores together, and you rotate them across the landscape in a planned manner, where you have an intense impact on the soil in, say, a 2-acre area or 5-acre area, and then you quickly move them on to the next. Sort of Alan Savory and others pioneered this system. But in the United States, we're seeing up to 12 tons of CO2 per acre being sequestered by these methods, by the holistic management. The ideal situation is one like Gabe Brown, where your pasture grasses, you're sowing a large number of different pasture grasses in the same pasture. And you're also bringing your animals together. We do this down here on my farm in Mexico. If you have a variety of livestock, you know, chickens, pigs, goats, sheep, cows, horses, grazing on a landscape of multi-species pasture, you get a supercharged amount of drawdown and carbon sequestration. Other examples in the United States that I was really happy to see a year ago in September, Scientific American finally interviewed Dr. David Johnson from New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, because they found that David Johnson, by looking at traditional indigenous ways of producing compost in a way that we modern organic farmers typically don't do it. We typically turn our compost piles. This is a way to produce a lot of compost relatively quickly. Well, David Johnson figured out if you start your compost pile, which he calls a bioreactor, with a lot of leafy material that has high fungal content, and that if you leave the pile, we use these cylinders, cylinder shapes with a screening around the side. We call it Maya sombra. It blocks the sun a little bit. But if you don't move that compost pile and you start out with a high fungal material in it, after about a year, and you keep it wet, after about a year, you have the most amazing compost that there is. That has 10 times the amount of fungal material as a normal organic compost pile would. And if you look at it under a microscope, you have an incredible richness of biological life. And so what Johnson has shown is if you use this compost, and ideally you don't use it in solid form because you've got a limited volume of this, but you put it into water and then you make what's called a compost extract, a simpler version of a compost tea where you don't stir it as long as a compost tea. You could put this liquid, 1 kilo of this David Johnson compost on our farm. We dilute it in about 125 gallons of water, and then we put it in backpack sprayers and we spray it all over the farm, on the trees, on the crops, you know, on the beds. And you get what Johnson has shown is that you can sequester up to 18 tons of CO2 per acre per year. Okay, this is way, way, way beyond anything you will find in the peer-reviewed literature. And hopefully some of these peer-reviewed journals are gonna pay attention. The Singing Frogs Farm, just north in Marin County, just north of San Francisco, it's a 2-acre farm, but they're sequestering 26.7 tons of CO2 per acre per year. And one very interesting thing about Singing Frogs Farm is that they're generating $200,000 worth of organic vegetables and herbs and flowers per acre. So it's not just the carbon sequestration, it's the economic advantage of doing things with nature regeneratively. And of course, if you look at a book like Eric Tonsmeyer's book, the Carbon Farming Solution, what you'll notice is that the kind of sequestration that we get in the United States from our best practices, grazing and intensive biodynamic and so on, you look across the world, there are things when you get near the equator grow really fast, and the largest amounts of carbon sequestration on the entire planet are these traditional forest polycultures, they're called, or say one of them I'm familiar with because I lived in Costa Rica for a while, cacao agroforestry system. If you have a multi-story farm where you got the tall trees, and then you got the medium level, and then you got the ground level crops like cacao, they're sequestering up to 40 tons of carbon per hectare. And that's per hectare, 16.4 tons of carbon. That's carbon, not CO2 per acre. Look at mangoes in the Philippines, and a system that we are really excited about down here in Mexico is a system of using desert plants to create a silvopasture system. In our case, it's these giant agave plants, which suck down their moisture from the air and grow huge. They'll grow to be a ton of biomass over a 10-year period. If you combine the agave, which grows in 20% of the landscapes of the world, with the nitrogen fixing trees that usually accompany any areas where there's agave growing, down here, mesquite, and in the southwestern US, mesquite, it's this combination of mesquite and agave. Farmers have learned how to ferment the leaves of the agave, which typically were always thought to be inedible by animals because they're extremely hard to digest. Once you ferment them though, you make a high quality animal feed of the fermented agave mixed with the mesquite that is a quarter to a half of the price of alfalfa, very nutritious for animals. And meanwhile, this system, which can be deployed on millions and millions and millions of acres of degraded land across Mexico and the world, sequesters 43 tons of carbon. This is not CO2, that's carbon per hectare per year, or about 17 tons. Okay, so I go into all these examples just to point out to you that we don't have to get 100% of the farmers to adopt regenerative practices across the world. That's not going to happen in 10 years, period. But if we can get a critical mass in the United States, I lay out the argument in my book that we need approximately 20% of our farmers and ranchers to adopt best practices, regenerative best practices at the same time that we go full blast on converting to alternative energy and ramping up energy conservation and reforesting with appropriate species in the right manner, all of the areas that have been deforested, both rural and urban. If we do all these things together, we can reach zero net emissions by 2030. What this will do is inspire the rest of the world, some of whom are ahead of us, but it will inspire the whole world that if the United States, the most powerful economic entity, along with China, can do this, we can do it as well. But
Ronnie,
there are severe, yes.
Just there are about 5 minutes, and then there's a Q&A of around 15 minutes. And I'm wondering if you could tell us something about the eco-restoration camps and your experience in developing that, because people want to hear about what they can do, the kinds of...
Yes. Yeah, I mean, individually, we can all do a lot, but I'm trying to stress what we can do collectively, what we must do collectively. The ecosystem restoration camps are part of the global regeneration movement that I've been involved with from the beginning. And the basic idea is to take a degraded ecosystem, which is about 40% of the farming ecosystems in the world today. Take a degraded ecosystem, bring in volunteers, and we use interns from Mexican universities and volunteers from the US and overseas. Bring in volunteers and utilize these basic permaculture techniques to begin to restore the environment. Because we can, yes, we can talk about the best practices of regenerative agriculture and ranching, but if you don't restore a degraded landscape before you begin farming or holistically grazing livestock on it, it's not going to work. And so it's this preliminary nitty gritty that most people don't have much experience with that's so important. And here in the high desert, one of the things you notice when you look out at the landscape is that you have these gullies, you have this erosion in the direction that the water's flowing. You notice when it rains, the runoff is brown. That's topsoil running off. You notice that all the irrigation systems are silting up and so on and so forth. You notice that the surface, the land surface is like a tabletop. It's like a that springs that were once there have dried up, and that wells
Ronnie, we lost
up.
you for about 30
and
seconds.
you know, the grass cover is looks like the moon landscape. We're not familiar regions as perhaps others. All right, yeah, internet. I got a signal on the internet. So we have to have ecosystem restoration. We have to have a literacy, a broad literacy among the population, slowing down water when it rains, planting appropriate species to slow down that runoff, and getting that rainfall back into the topsoil are absolutely key. We've all got to become tree planters and renovators of our environment. In the US, we have 60 million acres of lawns. We've got to convert those 60 million acres of lawns into regenerated landscapes that hold the rain, that hopefully produce some of our food that will also support a resurgence of trees, especially nut trees and fruit trees in our cities. And we can do this. And the important thing about urban ecosystem restoration, of course, is that Most people on the earth now live in urban areas. They're about half, at least, a little more than half. But in the United States, only about 14% of us live in rural areas. Okay? Yes, we have to carry out our regenerative practices and our ecosystem restoration in those rural areas, but most of the people are in the cities. And so that's why things like urban gardens and urban reforestation programs, food hubs, education in schools are so important. Most of the people we need to educate are in the cities, not in the rural areas. And we can have a really good interchange through things like volunteer farm working days once this pandemic clears up. We got to get urban people, especially young people, out visiting our farms, out getting their hands in the dirt. Back in the cities, we can all grow some vegetables like sprouted alfalfa, germinating alfalfa seeds is one great way to get going. But our windowsills, our patios, backyards can all become gardens. One of the bright spots about this pandemic has been a massive increase in interest in urban gardening. And our friends who run organic and heirloom seed companies are reporting they can't even keep up with the orders that are coming in now for seeds. Those of us writing about this situation, Organic Consumers Association and Regeneration International, our readership has grown between 300% and 500% in the last 2 months. And it's an indication that all this forced quarantine that we're under is causing people to think, it's causing people to learn. It's an opportunity for us to spread this message in a way that we haven't been able to as rapidly. And I think we're going to come out on the other end. Obviously, we're not eating in restaurants anymore, where Americans were spending 50% of their food dollars for the last decade. People are, you see the traffic on the internet for recipes, cooking. We're all learning how to be better cooks. We're all learning that, oh, I really like it that my 22-year-old son is sitting there having dinner with us every night. You know, I really like it that our farm workers at the organic farm are super interested in things that they didn't have time to think about before. So this is a nasty situation we're in, and it is very stressful, very scary. But one thing is that people are going into themselves. They're thinking about, what was I doing before? You know, going out to fast food restaurants, or, you know, destroying my health by eating too much sugar, or smoking cigarettes, or, you know, drinking too much alcohol. It's like, now we have the opportunity to look deeply into our daily life, into our souls, if you will, and make those changes. And I'm a perennial optimist. I believe coming out of this, when regenerative advocates like us talk about, we got to get rid of factory farms. We got to get rid of industrial grain production that feeds these factory farms. We got to stop using our land to produce corn for ethanol. We've got to stop destroying the remaining habitat of wildlife that are driving these viruses, you know, out of the forests and into the people and spreading across the country. I believe all these things that yes, we've all been talking about these things. I've been, for 50 years, I've been preaching about these things. But the difference now is that a larger percentage are willing to listen to us. And so I'm very
Ronnie,
excited.
This is really exciting. And we've got about 10 minutes left. And I'm wondering if you'd care to entertain some questions.
Definitely.
From
will these
people.
be in the chat? Will these be in the chat, or they'll be?
People have the option to unmute themselves. So we'll see how that works out.
All right,
if anybody...
I'll turn on my chat too in case
yes.
anyone.
So,
anybody?
One of the chat questions was said from Yulia, Dover, New Hampshire. She said, "What about monoculture, agricultural, industrial complex? How do we address these subsidized food monsters, fertilizer manufacturers? How do we reduce the damage? The Purdue's of the world, the GMOs, the industrial cattle industry." Well, this is worthy of a whole talk in itself, but as I point out in my book, the number one obstacle to regenerating the United States landscape, our food and farming, is our factory farm system of animal production. If we don't get rid of factory farms and the industrial grain production that feed these factory farms, we're not going to be able to achieve this net zero emission by 2030. Now, how do we do this? Well, I'd say the main thing is we got to stop paying farmers to farm badly, to farm the wrong way. We are subsidizing factory farms. We are subsidizing industrial agriculture. We are subsidizing GMOs. Our out of control political representatives are taking our tax money and our public resources and doing this. And I believe if we subsidize good practices, regenerative practices, as we've seen some of the political candidates articulate this year for the first time ever, people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and the Green New Deal. If we talk about a sizable amount of money over the next 10 years, I know Bernie's program was $840 billion to transform the U.S. food and farming system over the next 10 years. It's going to take some serious money to do this. But I guarantee you, if we pay farmers more to farm properly and to take care of the soil and to regenerate the soil, and we offer them the technical assistance from the farmers and ranchers who know how to do this, and landscape managers, a significant proportion will change. But if you look at urban America in general, for example, our group, we table every year at Future Farmers of America's convention. And this year in Indianapolis, there were 60,000 young people, junior high and high school. And we table, this is the 5th year in a row we've done that. And we talked to thousands of young people in rural America, most of whom are from the Midwest. And what we've learned is that the younger people, especially the girls and the young women, they don't like the practices that their father, especially their older white father, is carrying out. They see through this, and a lot of the boys and young men from rural America, they're a little more shy, they're afraid to say the wrong thing, they're afraid to be standing up there talking to an advocate for organic and regenerative farming, but they too are starting to understand. So what's going to happen in rural America is, as we change our system of subsidies, some of the older white guys are going to change. Most of them aren't going to change. Most of them are going to be retired in about 10 years. Most of them, it appears, are going to still keep voting for Trump. That's a fact, and we shouldn't waste our time believing that we're going to convince that segment of rural America that we should put all our effort. But the younger people and the women are different. That's where we're going to make the changes. And we are going to have an organic and regenerative form of agriculture in this country be the norm within 10 years.
Yeah. Ronnie, we have a whole list of chat questions, and you're scheduled for a workshop this afternoon at 1:30. So you can answer a lot of those questions. People can join you in your workshop for that. But right now, John Feldman has had his hand raised for quite a while. So John, let's give you a chance. John?
Okay, thank you, yes. First, I just want to say that I really appreciate what your group, Regenerative International, is doing. But I wanted to pick up on what Adam was saying at the beginning of the conference, his opening statement. And I've been trying to think that, so we need to, how could you rephrase, I'll say my questions and then you can answer. How could you reframe this entire thing without talking so much about carbon emissions? I think that the public and certainly much of the political establishment has gotten hung up on the idea that CO2 as a greenhouse gas is the sole cause of the climate crisis. And this has gotten us into a real problem. And so when we talk about the emissions and reducing emissions, it's that is not going to affect very much our climate crisis. And so I've been thinking about this a lot, and you've probably heard of Walter Yaney's talks. And the way to reframe it, it seems to me, is by talking about water and the water cycle and bringing that back into the equation. So I just want you to, you can answer that and see how, think about how you might do that. But the other thing that's been puzzling me, bothering me, and is that, you know, words are so important. And when we try to educate people, words are so important. And so what's crept into the language is this idea of drawing down carbon and sequestering carbon. And this is a very cause and effect, a linear way of looking at things. And obviously, nature does not regenerate any, sequester anything. Nature does not sequester carbon. The carbon is always cycled. And so when I hear this being used, we have a problem in that people think that what we have to do is somehow take CO2 out of the atmosphere and get it into the soil. And there are even, as you certainly know, there are even companies who have taken this so far that they're using great big machines to really suck the CO2 out of the air and put it in the ground that way. And so I think that a word like sequester gives the wrong impression. So I just wanted to throw those out there because I think the words we use are so important in trying to get people to understand that it's all about cycling things and cycling carbon and building life so we can cycle water. And then the only other thing I wanted to add is I've been talking to quite a few regenerative agriculture farmers who are Trump supporters, as hard as that is for me. And they are into regenerative agriculture because it's good for health and it saves them money. And if one sticks to those two things, better food and saving money, then there is an avenue to talk to some of these conservative farmers. And there are people, Gail Fuller is one, who are doing just that. So I don't think they're a lost cause. That's enough from me. Thanks.
Yes. Well, I think your points are very well taken. And I try to talk, I frame things the way that I think a particular audience is going to respond. You know, like yesterday, I was on a conference call with a bunch of small farmers here in Mexico, and we were talking about ecosystem restoration. And, you know, I don't even think I talked about the climate crisis. They see that weather's changed, but they're most interested in water. They're most interested in the fact that these methods of permaculture, we don't use that term here, but restoring the land mean restoring the water. And what they've noticed this year, after just 1 year of ecosystem restoration, is that there's more water in their communal wells, and that the ponds that they store water in for their livestock have a lot more water than they've seen in 30 years. So I agree. And as far as talking to farmers, I'm not saying we shouldn't try to reach Trump voters. I'm just saying that we keep that in, we keep it in perspective that yes, people are most concerned about health. If you look at the articles that I write about, Organic Consumers Association, most of our readers up until now have been primarily concerned about health. Secondarily, they're concerned about the environment and climate issues and issues of fair trade and justice. So different groups are really different. If I'm talking to a church group, I definitely have a very different presentation. If I'm talking to a climate group, I have a presentation. So I agree. And I agree the water cycle is key. And John, your points are extremely well taken. I'm just imagining what my previous talks were at this conference, and at the previous audiences in this conference were pretty darn sophisticated people who were not going to be put off by a somewhat technical language.
No, absolutely right, Ronnie.